incredible distrust we started to have with each other, the different factions of the world starting to fight with each other about the appropriate responses. In some ways, I hope that this can be a wake-up period and we can get to use our knowledge of the internet and our knowledge of devices and our knowledge of society and how the news can be weaponized. And we can now start to kind of rethink the world. It's difficult sometimes to be incredibly optimistic about things or to look at things in the past as opportunities or learning moments, but I really think this is a wonderful chance to rethink the world that we've created. It's a great chance to rebuild the world that we should have built. And we face this question really, which is, and I think this will run through many of your presentations, do we seek to return immediately and most efficiently to everything that we had pre-pandemic? Or do we try where possible and where appropriate to sort of reimagine the world and really to take a few steps back and to construct a better world based on what we have learned through this process? So the main question really, I think, that this session is about is how can we build the media environment that we need and that we deserve? I don't think I'm alone in thinking the quality of our media and the quality of our relationships with each other, the quality of the trust that we have between us and experts or government is incredibly important. And if nothing else, I would love this session to raise vital questions in all of us, really, about how important this is and how essential it is that we focus on it. I think in order to do that, we first need to sort of really understand where we are. And almost most importantly, how did we get here? Because it's only really by understanding the mistakes we made, and it's only really by understanding quite how significant this is, that we can put the pressure and the impetus that we need to make this much better. Now, unusually for me, this will be slightly depressing almost in places. It might be a bit shocking, it may be a bit one-sided, and it may make you feel a bit worse over the next 10 minutes than you'd like to. And I apologize for that. This is just my thoughts on the direction we took and how it went wrong. Wonderful quote here. There are only two industries that call its customers users. One is the illegal drug market, and the other is the modern world of media and social media. There is this idea that if you do not pay for the product, that you are the product itself. And this is somewhat terrifying because there are times when it feels like we are there to get addicted and we are there to be monetized and we are there to be sold, and we have not become the customers, we have become the users. Now, if we go back, this is the very first website or web page ever made, and life was simple then. We had the birth of companies like Yahoo with an incredibly simple website. We had the birth of Google. It can now contain 25 million pages. Can you imagine that? 1997, a World Wide Web of only 25 million pages. And life was simple then, and we didn't really know how big things were going to be. It's not like we created the foundations of the internet with full knowledge of how essential it would be. We did not necessarily foresee us working so much online and spending our lives so much online and consuming so much information online. And therefore, we did not necessarily put in the sort of plumbing that we would have done in retrospect. So when the internet was born, there was no real way to be charged for it. I think we can sometimes remember the DVDs or the CD-ROMs we'd put in, and we'd pay for the phone calls, we may pay for a certain number of minutes online, but when it actually came to the content itself, there was no way to charge for it. Which wasn't really a problem because people were not publishing that much, and most organizations that had really valuable content made the decision to put a bit of it on the internet. There would not be that much news, the websites would not look that great. So we had these very simple websites because they didn't really know what to do. Like if you're a newspaper and you've been used to selling copies of your newspaper, It's quite hard to do that in an environment where you can't take money from people. So they generally put the smallest amount of news that they could. So this is the New York Times website from 1996. It's lovely, but you're not going to spend your whole day reading this. Then we invented, or the concept of a banner ad was introduced, and suddenly it became possible for people to make money from advertising. And advertising had always been something that subsidized roughly 50% of the news industry. So this is not a sort of shocking revelation to newspapers publishers. And it allowed them to really exploit this environment where the production cost of advertising was zero. In the newspaper world, every advert shown was a piece of real estate that was not covered by a story. So people needed to balance out the number of ads with the amount of editorial, because it would take up valuable space. But in the online environment, that wasn't the case. You could just put up endless pop-up banners. And I don't think many of us remember this, but there was a whole period of the internet where there were adverts absolutely everywhere until someone discovered the pop-up blocker, and then we could get back to our own sanity. But there was a period of time around about 2006 onwards where newspapers really faced this big challenge, where increasingly sites like Yahoo or like Google or InfoSeek or Excite had started to get huge audiences and were making lots of money monetizing those audiences with banner ads. And newspapers face this battle. Do we either not embrace the internet? Do we put everything on the internet, or do we put some of it on the internet? And they slowly started putting more and more of their incredibly valuable content on the internet and making much better looking sites. And as a consumer, things were working out quite well. This was a time where newspaper writers would be writing the same pieces for both the internet and the newspaper, and the world was somewhat informed. Now, that worked out quite well for the audiences, but it worked incredibly badly for the newspaper industry, who lost huge sums of revenue. And we need to remember that newspapers are vital public services. This is how we get informed. This is how people fight for local causes. So this was not a insignificant problem. We just didn't realize it at the time. Now, slowly, newspapers started to try to sell subscriptions, but it really didn't work out. Like, the subscriptions the subscriptions gained by online reading did nothing really to recover the damage that was being done. So we did see newspapers seeing an incredible number of hits. It's not that people were not consuming news this way. It's that they were consuming news this way and the publications were losing vast amounts of money. So we saw renewed efforts to produce more exciting looking news sites, putting more news online, but it still wasn't working because almost all of the revenue lost was getting taken up by social media sites who were effectively sitting on top of other people's content. So companies like Google or like Facebook could simply pull through for free the content that was expensively made by brilliant publications. And this in some ways was the worst world for everybody, because it was no longer worth making particularly good content. Suddenly the economics kind of changed, where we realized that in order for news to be monetized, we needed to get as many clicks as possible. And that's what started really to change the way that we thought about news, or at least that the publications did. This lovely Marshall McLuhan quote, "First we shape our tools, then they shape us." We suddenly realized that taking the same things that we wrote and sticking them on the internet wasn't a very good idea. In fact, we needed to write entirely different pieces. We needed to measure success in different ways. We needed to really rethink what news was to become a sort of product that would most easily make money. There's this wonderful law called the Betteridge law of headlines, which basically means if there's a question mark in the headline, the answer is probably no. But I fondly remember a day where the job of a headline was to convey the most important news. The headline was there to suck readers into reading the entire article, but mainly by summarizing the main findings. Now, online media was different. So we have all sorts of kind of weird, crazy headlines that you can put out there, knowing that if you get enough intrigue, you can make money. And it never really mattered that these things were misleading. So if you said, was Darwin wrong? The fact that some people may not click the piece wasn't really your problem. It wasn't your job to inform, it was your job to make money. And we realized that simplicity sold. We realized that short form media was much, much more profitable than long form media, that people really wanted to have a simple point of view expressed rather than nuance, because nuance and complexity made us feel like we didn't understand something, and that didn't make us feel very good. And therefore, we tended to move on to other publications. More worryingly, we realized that outrage sold. Outrage is probably the most profitable and most sticky form of emotion you can ever create. And newspapers and algorithm generators like Google realized that by stoking outrage, we could get far more readers, far more clicks, and people were more likely to spend longer reading those pieces. And this is where things really took a bit of a turn for the worse, because we now have started to see in a media environment where everything seems like it's about stoking a sense of outrage. Quite often it appears that different parts of the population are kind of being trained to distrust or dislike each other. And we realize that beyond outrage, fear also sold. So we now see the rise of everlasting media stories and narratives that seem to always be expressed in the most negative way. If there's ever a chance to look at statistics of how pieces that report positively versus how pieces that report negatively perform, it's between 20 to 100 times more popular to produce a piece which is negative, which is basic human nature. Like, what we've ended up doing is using algorithms and the digital environment to sort of poke away at human nature and our sort of carnal needs to stay alive. We also realized that, the costs of media production and the costs of reporting really got in the way of profit. At this point, publications were not doing things with bad intent. They were simply trying to stay alive. And we realized that things like fact-checking, things like verifying sources, things like sticking to the journalistic code of ethics were kind of getting in the way. We realized that long form and investigative journalism and covering niche causes was really unprofitable, whereas moving things towards a sort of more facile, more celebrity focused environment where we didn't even have to send out photographers anymore was a much more profitable form of media. So we sort of moved towards a more facile media environment. And slowly over time, we're starting to see some metrics of society really change. We're starting to see our trust in media sort of really hit new lows. We're starting to see what I think is the most worrying thing, or the second most worrying thing, which is our concept of what's real and how we perceive the world is really starting to change. There are all sorts of memes that go around the internet that are always sort of celebrating almost how terrible things are. This is the sort of meme, "This is fine," which is showing the sort of world on fire around someone and them living in ignorance. And we almost have the opposite problem, which is that we're kind of obsessed with the fact that everything is getting terrible. And often it's not supported by data. We have these stories about the Great Resignation because everyone's unhappy with their jobs and they don't like their lives and they don't want to work anymore. But actually, the truth is that job satisfaction is pretty much gone up for each of the last 10 years. The sort of narrative doesn't fit our feeling about it. And if you ask people about the world in general, if you ask people in the last 20 years, has the number of people living in extreme poverty increased or decreased? And we see overwhelmingly in almost every single country, most people think that the proportion of people living in extreme poverty has actually got worse, that life is worse. If we ask them about things like child mortality, you'll see that many people think that things are about the same or getting worse. And if you actually look at the data around the world as a whole is incredibly positive. If you look at many of the things that really, really matter and affect our quality of lives and our length of lives and the quality of our offspring's life, almost every single metric has not just got better, but got better dramatically and quite recently. So this idea that people should think that everything is terrible while things are actually a lot better shows this huge gap between what is real and what is felt. And I think that best describes the way that the current media environment is not working for people. The media environment is there to inform people. It's not to be overly optimistic. It's not to necessarily tell us there aren't problems ahead, but we should do so in a context of real understanding of where we are. And I think that's leading to an environment where many people around the world are feeling a genuine and profound sense of despair. If you ask people in the US, how they feel about their own lives, we'll see that actually over the last sort of 30 or 40 years, people are generally pretty happy. People are generally content with things, and there's not radical change. If you ask people about how things are going in the US as a whole and how other people's lives are, we can see that plummeting. Again, this massive gap between how happy they are and how happy they think the sort of world is at whole is a huge demonstration on the amount of despair out there. If you ask people if the world's getting better, it's incredible how pessimistic people are around the world. It's incredible how many people think that things are getting worse. And when you ask these people, they will give you profound and real reasons, but they're not necessarily doing so in the context of the broader environment. And that leads to things like a massive rise in depression in US teenagers, a rise in suicide around the world. We see very dramatic headlines about how people are no longer wanting to have kids because the news environment is so negative that they don't want to bring their kids up in the future. Whether it's climate change, whether it's a perceived increase in terrorism, whether it's a perceived sense that life is unfair, there's less justice. The reality is that it's probably never been a better time to have kids. Most kids in the world now have a far, far greater quality of life than kids have ever had before. But again, our gap between perception and reality continues. In particular, we have this thing called doom scrolling, which is this sense that people get addicted to their social media feeds when it's negative news. And people are constantly on the refresh button on LinkedIn or on Twitter or on Facebook. And it's almost like our brain chemistry gets us into a loop where we cannot escape bad news. This most worryingly is leading to a very bifurcated society. Increasingly, we see that people have very different views, and the gap between those views is broadening. Whether it's how you vote, whether it's your views on other huge issues, we really see this sense of sort of tribalization, where how we feel about almost every topic seems to be driven apart further from each other, and we're almost asked to sort of distrust each other. And its ultimate point really is leading to a sense of sort of extremism and conspiracy. The rise of conspiracy theories has been noted. The way that the internet forms tribes, where we are surrounded by people who seem to see the world very similar to us, and we are told that we are very different to other people, is a very real thing. And I think a lot of that is coming down to the algorithmic nature of our news feed. Now, the news that we got has never been without bias. If you woke up in the UK and you went to a newsstand, you would see very different headlines on different newspapers. You would turn the TV channel and see different news reported in different ways on different channels. But we kind of knew that other viewpoints existed. If we picked up The Guardian, we would still know that some people pick up the Daily Mail. If we watch Fox News, we still know that other people watch CNN. The difficult thing about the digital environment is we're only ever shown a feed which works around us. So we are only ever aware of a worldview which envelops us. So we are led to believe that the way that we consume news is the right form of news, and the way that we are informed is the right information. And this shows not that we are terrible or naive people, but that algorithms exist to create an environment where we feel more comfortable with what we learn. So whereas the traditional news consumption, may have this sort of broad middle ground where news pieces almost drop, the modern media environment is so algorithmically driven that depending on what searches you do or what videos you like or what channels you subscribe to, we see a totally different world. I have a hypothetical scenario where a child at the age of 7, if they typed in "is climate change a hoax" versus "climate change is a hoax," they would end up with an entirely different worldview, an entirely different personal internet, just based on one Google search result. Because what tends to happen is the middle ground isn't really liked by the binary nature of the internet. The algorithms really are there to sort of move us to one side, and often move us to one side on a whole variety of issues. And I think it's this that's creating this sense of distrust of each other. It's this that makes us feel more certain about the views that we have. And I don't want to talk about this at length, but there are some thoughts that this is leading to the sort of post-truth age where everything's just getting a bit weird. Much of the media that we consume just seems a bit bizarre and confusing. Something like Elon Musk, sort of threatening to take on Vladimir Putin in a fight. It just shows we're in this sort of world where everything's feeling a bit sort of whimsical and a bit strange. There's the rise of the concern about fake news, but more than anything else, it's this notion that people are not seeking news to inform them, and people are not trying to think for themselves, but instead people are finding the things that they believe in, and they're creating a worldview which is always going to reinforce a sense of what they have already and what they believe already. And it means that it's very hard to build bridges and it's very hard to inform people. So that's the end of the slightly sort of depressing bit. But in summary, we're asked to do so much. Like, we were never born for an environment of 24/7 news. We were never born for a world which is global. We're not wired to do this. We are being asked to almost curate our own news. We do not have editors that decide what is good for us and what's worth reading and what is credible. We are asked these days to be informed. It's assumed these days that you are up to speed on all modern dilemmas. We are being asked to fact check our own news. We are constantly being fed things that are perhaps untrue or slightly presented in strange ways. And now the duty of care is on us to research everything we have. And we're almost being asked to become sort of PR departments for our own brands. Like, it's almost the case that you have to have opinions on everything, and you have to demonstrate your personality through opinions on everything. And if you are silent about a single topic, no matter what that topic is, that somehow you're complicit with that, which I think is quite a sort of scary sense of affairs. So we need to use this time really to sort of rethink the media environment around us. One big part of that is to think of the idea of someone curating your news diet. If you think a bit about information, it's a little bit like food. We may crave a sort of burgers and fries and a sugary soft drink, and it's okay for us to have that sometimes, but more often than not, we need to have food which is slightly less immediately desirable and slightly less likely to sort of trigger our senses, but takes a bit more time to digest and is good for us. We need the sort of broccoli, we need the sort of lentils, we need the sort of salad as well as the burger. And if we are left up to our own devices and we don't see ourselves getting fat, we end up choosing bad food. What we really need is a sort of maternal-like figure who can curate a good range of inputs such that we feel better. We need to sort of increase the role of fact-checking so we can be more assured in what we read and more likely to read things which are completely true. And we need to rethink the role of sort of guardianship in a way. How can we have long-term relationships with people who are there to provide a long-term role in our life of looking after us and giving us a broad sense of the complexities of the world? Now, many people think that the promise really of doing this comes from a sort of world of Web3 and NFTs. I'm not going to do a very good job of explaining NFTs in this sort of time-short environment, but what is interesting and relevant to this discussion is this idea that people can pay for assets in different ways, and people can take ownership of assets, and in particular that people have the ability to resell those assets in a way that gives the original creator of that content money in perpetuity. If you are to sell a NFT of a piece of art, every time that NFT gets resold again, you will receive a percentage of that profit. And this has the ability to totally affect the sort of distribution dynamics of all forms of media in the modern age. Now, most people at the moment, when they think of NFTs, they think of forms of art or images, at least like this, where there is a clear and very sort of fungible sort of market value and a very clear sense of what things are worth. But it has the opportunity really to be a mechanism that allows people who make music or people who make films or people who make any form of content to earn money in new ways. We see many celebrations of this. We're talking about how music industry can be changed by NFTs, but we're also seeing the theory that this can be applied to content that's written. So myself as a writer, rather than writing a book and getting a publishing deal, instead I could somehow turn it into a sort of digital token, which can be owned by people and then resold by people in a way that works for me. Now, if you can write books that way, there's no reason why you can't write articles that way. And there is a hope and a sense that by allowing people to write and to be paid directly for their content with a new distribution system, the news environment should be much better. Now, there's also a sense that the Web3 is a way of thinking and a philosophy and an architecture which should change the fundamental plumbing of the internet. There is a sort of hope that if Web 2 is simply about allowing anyone to contribute and anyone to read, the Web 3 is much more about ownership. So we fundamentally change the dynamics of the internet where people take ownership of what they write and they can be rewarded for creating. There is this sense that what Web 3 is really about is less about sort of social networks spreading content and much more driven by artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not that sure about this. I am not convinced that the problems of the existing environment are necessarily solved by NFT or the sort of philosophy of Web3. I am personally not convinced that artificial intelligence is a much better dynamic for spreading content than social, because most artificial intelligence is trained on human behavior and tends to replicate, if not exaggerate, sort of problems with human behavior. So if you were to write a sort of list of some of the problems really within the current news environment or paradigm, it's, number one, no one's really looking after us, no one's curating it for us. Number two, things that cost money like fact checking or in-depth or nuanced media tends to be less profitable. Problem three is that we are paying with our attention, which is done through advertising, which tends to lead to clickbait and simplistic stories and outrage and headlines which are lacking in depth. And we have a problem with sort of distribution, which means that there are problems with scaling, and it tends to reward companies that don't necessarily take full responsibility for what they publish. Now, unfortunately, if you go through all of those problems and you overlay Web3, and it's the very early days of Web3, so my understanding of it may be wrong or it may develop in different ways, but we tend to sort of see exactly the same problems still being maintained in that environment. I think there is a change in how we can pay for it, so it doesn't necessarily need to be via advertising, but it would be through some mechanism which rewards how many people see something and how many people have access to something. And that seems unlikely to change the desire that writers have to write pieces which are somewhat sensational. Like, in fact, if people are being paid directly for readership rather than advertising, it probably leads to a runaway effect where people don't need to keep advertisers happy, people don't need to produce brand safe content, and people just need to produce stuff which is really, really engaging to people, which hasn't worked out that well so far. So if not Web3, what can we do? Here are sort of 8 thoughts to lead with before we have a more open conversation with Sally, who I'm very keen to hear from on this. Number 1, and this always sounds a little bit unhelpful, but we really need to understand the depth of the problems this is causing. It is not insignificant that people feel a sense of despair. It is not insignificant that people feel genuine hopelessness and that there is a mental health crisis across almost all demographics. It is not insignificant that there are campaigns and protest groups around the world who are incredibly driven by fear and distrust of each other. We really need to get to grips with the fact that this could perhaps be the most important problem of our generation. There are other challenges around us, but we may be open-minded to the fact this could be number 1, or at least number 2, or number 3. So we need to think of this as a very serious thing. Secondly, more tactical, I think it's important that we start thinking of how platforms can be responsible for content. Sometimes platforms like Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, they act simply as a distribution mechanism. Sometimes they act as editors that decide what we should read. Sometimes they act as censors that decide what we can't read. We need to make a decision. Are these people who are dumb pipes and they have nothing to do with it and they have no right to play an editorial role? Or are these people who are publishers and they are responsible for everything they make and the factfulness of it and whether or not it's correct and whether the distribution of it is helping or hindering us? We need to change our mindset so that people who consume media are no longer users and instead they are customers. And if we think of them as customers, we have a long-term duty to take care of them. They have become people who are paying us money, and it is our job to keep them informed and keep them balanced and keep them entertained and keep them sane over a longer period of time. And that move will start to change the attitude that people have towards the media that they sort of promote. Now, that can either be done via micropayments or subscriptions. There are certainly problems to be figured out with how can you make sure that everyone in the world has access to good information regardless of their income and their disposable income. So there may be a role for charitable organizations. We probably need to start targeting writers by different metrics. At the moment, many writers are given engagement targets or they're given viewership targets, and they are not the best paid people in the world, and therefore they will take shortcuts. Perhaps we can find a way to measure the success of writers by more nuanced metrics, like how long people spend reading, are people likely to recommend their friends, are the subscriber base to your feeds growing, and things like that. We probably need to accept that advertising will always play a role in the future of media, and that's no bad thing. But we probably need to recognize that people's attention is worth a lot of money. At the moment, the economics of the internet are such that the more time we spend online and the more stuff we read, the more ad inventory is created. So the more time we spend online collectively, the more inventory there is, which means that the prices tend to be deflated because it almost tends towards infinity. And when supply tends towards infinity, the cost comes down. And that means that our attention is massively undervalued. It means that there are whole boatloads of websites out there that sell non-premium traffic. There is huge amounts of fraud in the industry. And I think a way towards a better quality of environment would be to have fewer, better ads that cost more money, that would be far more reflective of the value of their readers' attention. These are a little bit harder. These are a little bit more sort of philosophical ideas, but we should probably move towards a culture which is not based on being immediately up to date and knowing everything right now, but based more on a sense of sort of slow news. on having a sort of depth of understanding rather than an immediate reflex. I often like to think, what would happen if one newspaper was published every week? Or what would happen if a newspaper would cover news stories every month? Or what would happen if a newspaper was published every year? Which stories would end up making a sort of limited form of media like that? We would probably end up realizing that the sort of daily or hourly vicissitudes of life are actually not necessarily good for us to know about. I think we need to have algorithms which are designed not around bifurcating audiences and pushing people to extremes, but instead really around finding common ground. If you end up following someone that has, particularly extraordinary views towards, wildlife protection or the environment or politics or economics, why doesn't an algorithm either automatically follow someone with the opposite opinions or at least suggest people to give you a more balanced diet? Perhaps you can do an audit on your feed, which tells you what your biases are. Which kind of leads me to my last point, really, which is as a species, we are sort of programmed really to want to think that the world is simple. And we have many sort of biases that are out there. And one of the strongest one really is the idea of sort of confirmation bias. So when things make our worldview seem more complicated, we are sort of likely to sort of read them less. And that means we're kind of programming ourselves really to become quite entrenched in a viewpoint and to have a real depth of passion and belief behind a pre-existing worldview. And you realize that in a world of infinite data and infinite news, you can basically sort of believe anything you want. You can sort of create your own sort of sense of reality. Which kind of led me to this sort of slightly naive thought, really, which is if we see what we'd like to and what we've searched for, it would be possible for us to see a better world. It would be highly, highly, highly possible for us to realize quite how compassionate the world can be. And it would be very easy for us to be very optimistic about what we can become. And we don't need to suspend reality. We don't need to be ignorant. But we can all get to grips with some of the fundamental positive stories that are out there and to realize that generally speaking, for most people, the world over a reasonable period of time is getting a lot better. And we can be part of a process of sort of spreading joy and making the world a little bit closer, a little bit more understanding of each other, a bit more empathetic, a bit more imaginative, and a bit more sort of optimistic. And in many ways, that's the sort of ethos of my company. What can we do today to make the world better and to embrace change for good? Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Tom. There's a ton of food for thought there that we need to talk about, we need to discuss. And I love that we've already got questions coming in from our audience around this. And so I want to jump into that whole idea about the evolution of journalism and where it needs to go next, particularly as we look at the act of great and in-depth journalism, the fact that, fact-finding, verifying and developing a story that not only answers questions in a fundamental way, but that broadens our understanding of the world and perhaps raises new questions, which is always a good thing. That's essential to great journalism. But obviously this is something that requires time. It requires research and reflection. And yet at the same time, we are now so used to getting things instantaneously, immediately, and we almost expect it. So how do we go back to that? Because, these business models are also driven by consumer behavior as well. So how do we go back to really embracing that once again?
That's a great question. It kind of goes to the heart of everything. Something I want to make clear is that hopefully this presentation doesn't seem overtly critical of the general news industry. Journalists do an incredible job, and journalists have incredibly good intentions by and large. If anything, the problem really has been the distribution mechanism has been left up to tech companies, and tech companies have traditionally approached this in a less sort of empathetic and nuanced way. So we have the talent that we need. We have people that want to report on stories that need to be told. We have, reporters that want to shine a light into the complexity of topics. We have reporters that want to get us to ask questions and think more. I think the first stage is to realize quite how problematic this is and quite how this journey goes. And then probably to put in place systems, and some of that is regulation, and some of that is financial models, and some of that is perhaps a sense of sort of charitable models, but some of it is training. I mean, we have to be in a situation where we are comfortable with the idea of talking to somebody who has profoundly different but informed opinions to us. We have to be comfortable with the idea that jumping to conclusions is not a sort of desirable trait. We have to get to grips with the idea that if we think that most modern situations are simple, we are probably not understanding them. If we think that climate change is not happening, we are probably not understanding them. If we think that climate change is worse than anyone ever thought, we are probably not understanding these things. So we need to sort of really love to work out our brains in a way. I think people are very proud to go to the gym 7 times a week. People would endlessly take Instagram pictures of their body improving, but not as many people want to take pictures of their bookshelf or show their internet search history to show how hard they've been working out their brains. So I think we should be forgiving of ourselves. Like the internet, and this is something we talked about before, Sally, the internet happened very quickly in our lives, and we are basically animals, and what's happened is the algorithms have sort of taken advantage in a way of our basic human chemistry, and we've ended up in this situation without realizing it. If you were to ask most people, 30 minutes ago what they were doing with their time or what newspapers they read yesterday, they would be a little bit embarrassed probably, because we've almost been tricked into behaving the way we have. So I think shining a light on this and getting people to realize this is a problem and they need to work harder to fix these problems is a really big part of it.
And to that point exactly, that we have been, living these technologies for some years now, but we still haven't really mapped out the full impact. And yet we're being asked to jump into something new once again in terms of Web3, in terms of the metaverse. So I'm going to go there with you now. And there are questions that are coming in from people around that as well. We haven't fully understood the impact of Web2. But now we are seeing technologies that are asking for us to be even more deeply immersed into these digital spaces, requiring a lot more deeper engagement, right? So first of all, does the metaverse actually solve a problem, or is it mostly just asking us to live inside what feels like a computer game and trying to make that experience seem, quote unquote, as real as possible? Is that really going to add to our lives?
I mean, it's a very interesting way of thinking. If the virtual world becomes so embracing, and if it starts to feel so real, like at what time does it become so real it is effectively reality? I personally believe I know enough about technology and its implications, and I know enough about the motivations and the personality types of people in the tech space, that it's very hard for me to see this becoming a sort of softer, more empathetic, more connected world. I think, if anything, it's likely to amplify drastically the situation we have now, where we don't need to be in a pub and talk to someone who's next to us and realize they voted for someone different. Instead, we can concoct around us. My screen just changed. Instead, we can sort of concoct a world around us, which reinforces the same sort of viewpoints that we have. And I think there's something very dangerous. But again, we can look at these things in positive ways. If the metaverse is very additive to our environment, if we program the algorithms such that they're designed to make us form connections with people who are different to us, if they allow journalists to tell richer, more human stories in more compelling ways, by immersing us in the lives of refugees now, or people who are protesting for forces for good. But my concern is that the mechanisms that we've seen so far will probably be replicated. And if anything, we need to go to the opposite. The sort of the Roman Forum, where you would come along and listen to people standing on soapboxes expressing their views. Books which are not immediate but are presenting a broader context of history, so we can see current news within the broader perspective. I think I'm not a hippie, and I don't think we should all reject technology, but I think we have to be very careful about how we embrace everything that's new. And I think we should default now to doing it properly, rather than suddenly.
And I think that's the thing, we're definitely not Luddites, but I think it's really important that we ask, these questions about the technology that is being presented to us. And to that point of being able to go into someone's life, currently you can go on a live on somebody's platform and you can see anything from them having their lunch to the protest march that thousands of people have suddenly just joined. So we're already getting that omnipresent feeling of being everywhere at once and people talk about the fact that we are getting a global perspective with social media currently as it is, and probably more within the metaverse. But does that actually serve us, or is that kind of it making the problem worse and bringing up apathy within us? Because it's overwhelming. The amount of content and the intensity of the content becomes so overwhelming. We feel helpless. We feel like it's just too much. And then it's just like we want to switch off. What's the balance? How do we balance that out so that we actually can use this technology to help us to solve these big issues, racism, climate change, the refugee, whatever it is? So how do we avoid that kind of that burnout, really, from really taking?
Yeah. I mean, it gets to the very heart of this, which is, fundamentally, we are a species that's wired for scarcity. We are programmed to not have enough food, so we get fat. We try to eat as much as we can when we can. We are programmed to deal with unreliable water. We are programmed to deal with a need to build tribes, so that we have people within our community who can take care of us. We are programmed to have a lack of information, so we need to know as much as we can whenever we can. And technology is effectively, precisely like you put it, it's created this enormous sort of water pipe with so much water and with such a rapid flow that you can either stay out of that water flow and then sort of die of thirst, or you have to be in it and just be overwhelmed by everything. Now, the very, very good news is we have all of this stuff. We have all of the technology we need to do amazing reporting. We have better technology than we've ever had before to distribute things. The promise of the internet is that we can be more informed than ever. We can learn languages. We can talk to anybody in the world. We can have a sort of one-on-one relationship with a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa. We can connect with a sort of nomadic leader in Mongolia. We have everything we need. It's just sort of being drowned out by abundance. And that's probably one of the better starting points to have. If our problem is that we don't have this thing and we need to find it and create it, that's a problem. But it's much more about training us, I think, to recognize that this is a problem, and that it's not necessarily our duty as a human being to read every single news source. It's not necessarily our duty as a human being to stand for every single movement that's out there. And we probably all need to take a bit of a step back. And in a way, this was what the pandemic could have been, or was for some people, a chance to really take a step back, to realize that they're not doing their sons and daughters badly by not reading the news over breakfast, and to try and get a sense of cadence, really. Perhaps, if social media is about up to the second news, perhaps we almost need to sort of rethink what the cadence of news should be. perhaps it should be something that we spend 15 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the evening reading every day. And it just becomes 2 data points in our life every day. And perhaps if we did that, we'd realize that the quality of that time is very important, which would make the value of that time incredible, which means that the burden would be on people to write incredibly good pieces and to record wonderful videos and perhaps to build a brilliant metaverse environment, but one which is, carries the full perspective and carries the things that really matter. And one of the very scary things about the current media environment is, you start to lose a sense of, is this really important? We've been told this thing today. Was that because they had good video footage of it? Was that because someone asked them to? Was that because they know it's going to get more clicks? And I think we have a duty, perhaps, on all of us to, when we're consuming news, think, is this helping me? If I spread this sort of hopeless video of some town that's been devastated, am I helping the world? Because sometimes you will be. Sometimes it's a story that needs to be told. Sometimes it's an angle that needs to exist. Sometimes it's something that people don't know enough about. But I think increasingly, we don't need to necessarily carry on showing horrible tragedies of people dying in hospital from COVID. I don't think that's necessarily that helpful anymore. And there could be a point where spreading things which show the great hope in the world and the great progress we've made in the world, there could be a point where, showing wars that have now ended. There may be a point where showing how things have improved. There may be a point where it becomes, useful to us to also celebrate moments which give us a sense of hope, present perhaps a more accurate picture of the world, and make us feel closer together. Like fundamentally, people are amazing, and our intentions fundamentally are very good. We all really believe in the same greater goals in life. We all kind of want pretty much the same things. We only ever really disagree on the precise tactics we may use to get there. And it would be nice if the media environment could recognize that.
I have so many more questions and kind of comments around that, and but I'm just very aware that we really need to. We're running out of time. We need to get to the questions that have been put through by our audience. So this one asks, how do we address the ethics and ownership matters? Are smart contracts smart enough? I guess when you're talking about NFTs and on the blockchain, is that enough, or do we need something more?
I actually think they're too much. I think, without being too brief in answering this because we're running out of time, NFTs are way more complicated than they need to be. Not everything needs to be recorded on the blockchain. We have copyright already. It is possible to use the philosophy and the infrastructure of web3 and NFTs to make the media world better. But we could also use databases and Google Docs and credit cards, and that's a much, much more elegant way to do it, if you ask me.
Okay. Is Web3 in the age of privacy freedom, or is it the age of decentralized privacy? Interesting question there.
Privacy is a very weird one. If we assume that people want privacy, we assume that our personal data is very important to us, but we don't behave that way. We have tech companies make presentations and everyone nods because privacy is good, decentralization is good, owning our own data is good. Is it? I mean, actually, a pandemic showed us that it's great if we can share data. It's great if we can aggregate data. People don't act like they want privacy. There are virtually no industries or categories that decentralization is a better approach towards. As people, we are better off as nations coming together than, villages arguing amongst each other. So I think we need to challenge some of these ideas. Decentralization is not necessarily a good thing. It's really about the right altitude of centralization, but that's a different topic.
Okay, and kind of a final question from me about our sense of self and our sense of who we are as we progress into things like the metaverse that really immerse us into new avatars and new identities. It's interesting. I've been speaking to other futurists where they're like, this is a great thing because when people work within the metaverse and when they show up there, groups that like women and like minorities, they get to present themselves in a whole different way. You can present yourself any way that you can. So if you're a pregnant woman, if you have kids, you can show up in a whole different way where that is no longer going to be biased against you by your employer. But is this solving the problem? Or is this kind of exacerbating the existing issues that we have, that we should be accepting women in that way, that we should be embracing, different groups? And so your quick thoughts on that?
My very quick thoughts are, I mean, we've struggled really to adapt to an internet age and to what that means for ourselves and our identity, and to go another leap ahead and change this idea that we can sort of change who we are, and we can change how people see us, and we can change how people address us. I mean, there's a lot of promise in that, but it also raises lots of questions like, what does our self become, and what is our reputation, and who are we? And it would be very ignorant for me as a sort of white straight man to, suggest there isn't an awful lot of positive things that can happen there. But I worry in a way. I think in a way we should be much more internal. We should be focusing much more on who we really are. We should be focusing much more on why we feel the way we do. We should be much more introspective. I think the slightly scary thing about the internet age is we are all very outward facing. It's all, what do people think of us? Why do people treat us that way? Will this be good for my career? Well, maybe we need to just, go back and look on ourselves a bit. What's important to us? What does success mean to us? What we really like. Maybe we should do that first, and then when we have a really strong understanding of ourselves, then we can go into the metaverse and explore different personas or something.
Yes, absolutely. Very quickly to that point about looking at it from different perspectives, a question has come in asking, what are the obstacles for media in underdeveloped countries versus developed countries as well? So what do you see there as the opportunities?
When it comes to the technology we need to operate in a contemporary media environment, with remarkably few exceptions, there is no developing or underdeveloped world. If you have a smartphone and you've got 3G, you can be a journalist. More provocatively, it's probably more the power structures and the governance and the sort of societal expectations. They're probably the things holding it back. So the question really becomes, how do we use this technology to, create a media environment that is beneficial? Not what do we need to do that, but how do we think about it more?
Yes, absolutely. We have to wrap up now. Tom Goodwin, it is always an enormous pleasure to talk to you. There is so much more to this, and I have no doubt there will be more conversations around this. I want to thank you so much for being with us this afternoon or this morning, your time as well. So thank you so much, Tom.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you to our incredible audience for being with us as well. Thank you to the Mohammed bin Rashid Knowledge Foundation and UNDP for collaborating on the Knowledge Summit 2022 and showcasing these vital conversations as well. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next time.